A law protecting dying Australians from a pressured, unprompted phone call has survived 2 years of pushback. That is now under pressure from inside the Prime Minister's own party. Recently, Anthony Albanese has been under fresh pressure at Labor's national conference to undo a safeguard that has been held for 2 years. Back in 2023, Labor's conference voted to review the law that stops doctors discussing euthanasia over the phone or video, a ban still standing today. A senior Labor source told The Australian the reason is that Albanese doesn't want to fight with the Catholic Church over what Labor supporters are calling a minor change. But if it's really a minor change, why is Albanese using the church as a cover to avoid a fight over it at all? Independent MP Kate Chaney says people shouldn't be disadvantaged because of where they live. The Australians Medical Association's Danielle McMullen agrees, warning doctors could face criminal liability just for talking to a patient about euthanasia. Nobody should be disadvantaged by their postcode. That's the part everyone agrees on. The problem is what's being offered as the solution. Almost 30% of Australians live rurally. Only 16% of the specialist palliative medicine workforce works outside the cities. Palliative Care Australia is using these figures to make a direct case to the government. Fund more rural palliative care workers so patients in the country get the same access to specialists that people in the cities do. And here's the thing about the barrier to care claim. Euthanasia is already reaching regional Australians at scale without telehealth. Since 2019, more than 7,200 people have died by euthanasia nationally, including 3,329 in the last financial year alone, 1 to 3% of all deaths in the country. In New South Wales, 2/3 of those deaths are in regional areas. If where you live should not decide whether you can end your life sooner, then neither should it decide whether you get proper care whilst you are living. Look at how fast this has moved regardless. When Victoria's scheme passed in 2017, the government predicted around a dozen people would use it for the first year. Instead, 837 people requested euthanasia in 2024 to 2025 alone. The review board's own word for that number was unprecedented. 389 people died. That's 1,683 deaths since the scheme began, and the board itself is projecting 1,300 requests a year by 2028. That's not a dozen a year, that's 2 dozen a week and climbing. Instead of treating that as a reason to slow down, Victoria just loosened the rules and not everyone in the government was comfortable with it. When the amendment bill passed the lower house, 5 sitting Labor MPs crossed the floor to vote against their own government. The changes, removing the gag clause that stopped doctors raising euthanasia unprompted, also extending the required prognosis from 6 months to 12, and cutting back the number of required medical assessments. Every one of those was originally sold as a deliberate safety measure. Now they're advocated as removing an unnecessary barrier, and the oversight looks thin. In Victoria, neither assessing doctors have to be a specialist in the patient's actual condition. Over a recent 2-year period, not one euthanasia application was refused. There are no routine audits, no random case reviews, and no requirement to report adverse events. Meanwhile, euthanasia looks set to return to the Northern Territory. Its own parliamentary committee recommended introducing it with no prognosis timeframe at all, which would have made it looser than any scheme in the country from day one. To the government's credit, its response this year pushed back against that and put a 12-month timeframe back into the draft bill. That's worth watching closely as it goes through the Assembly, because it's exactly the kind of safeguard that gets quietly negotiated away once a bill starts moving. Every one of these expansions gets framed as dignity, autonomy, and choice. Nobody's arguing for cruelty, and that's exactly why the language matters. Genuine compassion looks like investment, a rural nurse who can actually visit, a palliative care bed that exists when it's needed, and a GP trained to have an honest conversation about dying. Nobody knows how many of these people requesting euthanasia each year are choosing it freely, and how many are choosing it because the alternative, good pain relief, real support, was never actually offered to them. Victoria's own figures show demand climbing every year, but palliative care funding hasn't kept pace. That's not proof euthanasia is being forced on anyone, but it should at least raise the question of how much of this demand is really a demand for euthanasia, and how much of it is a plea not to be be left to die alone. That gap between what's being funded and what's being expanded is the real story here. Underfunded palliative care is being used to push people towards euthanasia, while the safeguards that made it acceptable in the first place keep getting quietly stripped away. Don't let that pass without question. When you hear someone call this progress, ask them why proper care for the dying still isn't being funded at the rate euthanasia is being expanded. That's the argument worth having, not whether the ban holds, but why dying Australians can't get the quality care that would make euthanasia unnecessary.